John Wayne Gacy was regarded as a friendly, well-respected, ambitious man in his Illinois community. He had a wife and kids, successfully managed several KFC restaurants, and eventually started his own successful construction company. Gacy was heavily involved with his community and its local chapter of the Jaycees, a nationwide organization that helps men between the ages of 18 and 40 develop leadership skills. In his spare time, Gacy performed as a clown for local birthday parties, charities, and children's hospitals. He also kidnapped, raped, tortured, and murdered at least 33 teen boys and young men between 1972 and 1978. This would earn him the nickname Killer Clown. How did such an upstanding citizen turn into a sadistic murderer? Born on March the 17th, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois, Gacy's early life was not without its challenges and traumas. Though he was close with his sisters and mother, Gacy's father, John Stanley Gacy, was a different story. A violent alcoholic, Gacy Sr. often physically and verbally abused his wife and children. Gacy spent his childhood and adolescence trying to win his father's approval. Gacy's mother attempted to shield him from the abuse, but this only enraged his father more. In 1949, Gacy was molested by a family friend. This friend would pick Gacy up in his truck and fondle him. Gacy never told his father for fear of being blamed. In school, Gacy was an average student with few friends and was the occasional target of bullying. The friends Gacy did have stated that Gacy Sr. often lashed out at him physically and verbally for seemingly no reason. Due to a congenital heart condition, Gacy was unable to participate in school sports. He also suffered from seizures and blackouts due to an undiagnosed condition. Gacy didn't finish high school, but at 18, he began working for a Democratic Party candidate in his area, a decision that his father did not approve of. Due to increasing tension at home, Gacy moved to Las Vegas, Nevada in 1962 and found work as a mortuary assistant. He slept at the mortuary and observed the embalming process. Gacy would later confess that while alone, he once got into the coffin of a dead male teenager. He embraced and caressed the body before he was overcome by shock at his own actions. This prompted Gacy to return home to Chicago after just 3 months in Las Vegas. Once back in Chicago, Gacy enrolled in Northwestern Business College despite never finishing high school. He graduated in 1963 and quickly rose through the ranks of a shoe company in Springfield to become manager of his department. He married his co-worker Marilyn Myers in 1964 and joined the Springfield Jaycees. He decided much of his time and effort to the organization and was named its key man in April of 1964. Also in 1964, Gacy had his second homosexual experience. Gacy later stated that a fellow Jaycee got him drunk and invited him to sleep on his sofa. The man performed oral sex upon Gacy while he was drunk. In 1965, Gacy became the vice president of the Springfield Jaycees and was chosen as the third most outstanding Jaycee in all of Illinois. Gacy and Marilyn moved to Waterloo, Iowa, in 1966 to manage his father-in-law's 3 KFC restaurants. Gacy joined the Waterloo Jaycees. He worked extended hours at the organisation in addition to his 12 or 14-hour shifts at the restaurants. He quickly established himself as an exemplary and ambitious member. Gacy was awarded the title of Outstanding Vice President of the Waterloo Jaycees in 1967 and served on its board of directors. Madeline gave birth to a son in 1966 and a daughter in 1967. Gacy would later describe these years as perfect. Not only did he have a family of his own, but he was a successful manager of 3 restaurants and a highly regarded member of his Gacy chapter. In July of 1966, Gacy's parents visited him in Ohio, and his father apologised for the years of physical and mental abuse. He admitted that he had been wrong about his son. Gacy finally had his father's approval, but Gacy wanted more. The Waterloo Jaycees engaged in the drug use, pornography, wife swapping and prostitution. Gacy participated frequently in many of these activities. He often cheated on his wife with prostitutes. He also transformed his basement into a club where his employees were invited to drink and play pool. Gacy clearly favoured his teenage male employees. He would give them alcohol before making sexual advances. If they denied his advances, Gacy would make light of the situation, claiming that he was joking or testing their character. Gacy would commit his first sexual assault on a teenage boy in August of 1967, but it would be just the start of his reprehensible crimes. Gacy's first sexual assault victim was 15-year-old Donald Voorhees. Voorhees was a son of another Gacy member in Waterloo. Gacy convinced Voorhees to come to his house by promising to show him a porn film. Once at the house, Gacy gave Voorhees alcoholic beverages and coerced the teen to perform oral sex on him. But Gacy wasn't satisfied. Over the course of the next several months, Gacy would sexually assault numerous other teen boys. Donald Voorhees came forward about the assault to his father in March of 1968. They took the case to the police and Gacy was arrested for the assault on Voorhees and an attempted assault on another teen boy. Gacy adamantly denied any involvement in either incident. He even claimed that the accusations were fueled by local politics. Donald Voorhees' father had run against Gacy for the presidency of the Waterloo Jaycees. Several Jaycees sided with Gacy despite his indictment. In September of that year, with the case in full swing, Gacy hired one of his employees to corner Voorhees, spray him with mace and beat him to keep him from testifying. Voorhees immediately went to the police after he escaped and the attacker was arrested. He confessed that Gacy paid him to assault Voorhees. Gacy was again arrested with the additional charge of hiring someone to assault and intimidate Voorhees. Shortly after this attack, Gacy was ordered to participate in a psychiatric evaluation. 2 doctors observed him for 17 days. They concluded that Gacy had antisocial personality disorder. According to their report, the most striking aspect of the test results is the patient's total denial of responsibility for everything that has happened to him. However, they deemed him mentally fit to stand trial. Though he pled guilty to the oral sodomy charges against Voorhees, Gacy claimed that the youth pursued him. Gacy was convicted of December the 3rd, 1968, and sentenced to 10 years at an Anamosa State Penitentiary, a maximum security prison. On the same day Gacy received his conviction, his first wife, Marilyn, filed for divorce. He never saw Marilyn or their children again. Gacy quickly became a model prisoner. After just a few months, he became the head cook. He joined the inmate Gacy chapter and grew their numbers from just 50 members to over 650 in less than 18 months. He took charge in several projects to improve life for his fellow inmates. Gacy was granted parole with 12 months of probation in June of 1970. He served just 18 months out of his 10-year sentence. Gacy moved back to Chicago. In February of 1971, Gacy was again arrested for sexually assaulting another teenage boy. The case was eventually dismissed when the victim failed to appear in court. Gacy's parole board in Iowa was never made aware of this incident, and his parole ended 8 months later, with his records in Iowa sealed a month after that. Gacy's mother helped him buy a home at 8213 West Summerdale Avenue. This is where Gacy would go on to commit all 33 known murders, and where most of his victims would be buried. In June 1972, Gacy was arrested for assault and reckless conduct by a youth who claimed that Gacy impersonated a police officer and forced him to perform oral sex. This case was also dropped after the victim tried to blackmail Gacy into paying him to drop the charges. Gacy married Carol Hoff in July 1972, and Carol and her 2 daughters moved into the Summerdale house. Shortly after this, Gacy started his construction business, PDM Contractors. While Gacy and his employees initially worked on minor repair projects, the company eventually grew to include more extensive work, such as remodeling, interior design, and landscaping. Because Gacy hired many teens and young men, he found some of his victims amongst his employees. As Gacy's business grew, he also became heavily involved in his community. His neighbours found him to be charming and generous with his time and resources. He hosted annual summer parties. He actively participated in Democratic Party politics. During this time, Gacy joined the Jolly Joker Club and began performing as his characters Pogo the Clown and Patches the Clown. He served on and led local committees and organised Chicago's annual Polish Constitution Day Parade from 1975 to 1978. Thanks to Gacy's work on the parade, he was photographed with First Lady Rosalind Carter in May of 1978, 7 months before his final arrest. All the while, Gacy was kidnapping and murdering teen boys and young men in his home. With business booming and the respect of his community secured, Gacy committed his first murder in 1972. 16-year-old Timothy Mccoy was picked up by Gacy at a Greyhound bus terminal on January 2nd, 1972. Mccoy was on his way to Omaha from Michigan. Gacy offered to show him around Chicago and let him sleep on his couch before bringing him back to the bus terminal the next day. When he woke the next morning to see Mccoy standing in his doorway holding a knife, he assumed the boy was threatening him. They struggled, but Gacy gained the upper hand and eventually stabbed Mccoy several times in the chest, leaving a large blood stain on his bedroom carpet. Shortly after killing Mccoy, Gacy discovered that the teen had cooked breakfast and set the table for the two of them. He realised that Mccoy had simply come to wake him up for breakfast. But Gacy admitted that he experienced an intense orgasm as he killed the boy. He buried Mccoy in the crawl space in his home and later poured concrete over the grave. Mccoy was Gacy's first victim and the first to be buried in the infamous crawl space that would go on to house many more boys and young men. Gacy's second known murder didn't occur until January of 1974. His second victim remains unidentified to this day, but he is estimated to have been between 14 and 18 years old at the time of his death. Gacy strangled him and buried this victim in the backyard under his barbecue pit. In 1975, Gacy began to more frequently seek out sexual encounters with young males. Gacy himself referred to this as the start of his cruising years, when he would lure and murder the majority of his victims. Many of Gacy's employees at his construction company were young men and high school students, providing the perfect cruising ground for Gacy's twisted plans. In July of 1975, Gacy lured his 17-year-old employee and third victim, John Butkovich, to his home. Butkovich was upset with Gacy over not being paid for 2 weeks. He arrived at Gacy's house to settle the dispute and to get his paycheck. Gacy tricked the teen into wearing handcuffs, a ploy Gacy would refer to as his handcuff trick. He would typically get his victims drunk or gain their trust in some way before showing them a pair of handcuffs. He sometimes claimed that the handcuffs were part of his clown performance. Once his victims were cuffed, he would rape and torture them until it was time for his rope trick. The rope trick consisted of tying a rope around the victim's neck into a tourniquet to strangle them. Gacy strangled Butkovich to death and buried him under the floor of his garage. Butkovich's father contacted Gacy about his son's disappearance, and Gacy offered to help search for the youth. For the next 3 years, Butkovich's parents reached out to the police more than 100 times. They wanted Gacy investigated, but their requests were ignored. In October of 1975, Gacy's wife Carol asked for a divorce after arguing over business finances. The divorce was finalized in March 1976, and Carol and her 2 daughters moved out of the Summerdale Avenue house. After his divorce, Gacy's cruising became a far more regular occurrence. He kidnapped and killed several teen boys within just a couple of months, including 14-year-old Samuel Stapleton. Stapleton was one of Gacy's youngest victims. 2 more teens were killed in June of 1976, as well as one unidentified adult male. James Hackinson was 16 when he went missing on August 5th, 1976. Hackinson's body wasn't identified until 2017. Another teen and 2 more unidentified males were killed between August and October of 1976. Gacy allowed one of his employees, David Cram, to move into his house as his roommate. Gacy attempted to rape Cram on multiple occasions, and Cram moved out a month later. He was replaced by another employee, Michael Rossi. In late October 1976, Gacy kidnapped and killed two young friends, 16-year-old Kenneth Park and 14-year-old Michael Marino. They were buried in the same grave in the crawl space. Just 2 days later, a PDM contractor's employee named William Bundy also disappeared. 17-year-old Gregory Godzik had been an employee of PDM contractors for 3 weeks when he went missing in December 1976. Godzik had told his family that Gacy hired him to dig trenches in his crawl space, the same crawl space he would later be buried in. In January 1977, John Shates, a friend of Gacy's other victims, Butkovich and Godzik, disappeared. Gacy kept Shates' ring, which was engraved with his initials. Gacy sold some of Shates' other belongings to his roommate, Rossi, before Rossi moved out. Gacy killed 9 more teens and young men in 1977. On December the 30th, 1977, Gacy kidnapped 19-year-old Robert Donnelly from a bus stop at gunpoint. Gacy brought Donnelly to his home, where he raped and tortured him, all while nearly drowning him, only to revive him again. Gacy eventually drove Donnelly to his workplace and released him. Donnelly immediately reported the assault to the police, and Gacy was questioned. But Gacy claimed that the incident was consensual. The police believed Gacy and didn't file any charges. In February of 1978, Gacy killed the last victim that would be buried in his crawl space. The remaining victims would be disposed of in the Des Plaines River. In March of 1978, Gacy kidnapped 26-year-old Jeffrey Rignall. Gacy repeatedly chloroformed Rignall into unconsciousness while brutally raping and torturing him with various instruments. Gacy took his unconscious body and left him in a park. But Rignall was still alive, and when he regained consciousness, he reported the assault to the police. They didn't investigate. Rignall took it upon himself to stake out the area he was kidnapped from and look for Gacy's car. In April, he successfully identified the car, and he tracked it to 8213 West Summerdale Ave. Finally, the police issued an arrest warrant for Gacy and arrested him in July. While he awaited trial for the Rignall assault, Gacy continued his murder spree. Once Gacy realized that his crawl space could no longer hold his victims, Gacy turned to the Des Plaines River. He murdered 4 more males that have been accounted for in 1978 that were later thrown into the Des Plaines River. Gacy would later claim that he disposed of 5 bodies in the river, but only 4 were recovered. On December the 11th, 1978, Gacy kidnapped his last victim, 15-year-old Robert Peast. Gacy had gone to the Des Plaines pharmacy to discuss a remodel job with the owner. Peast was working at the pharmacy when Gacy mentioned that his company hired teens. When Peast's mother arrived to pick him up after work, he told her to wait while he talked to someone about a construction job. Peast never returned, and his family filed a missing person report. The police contacted Gacy and he denied any knowledge of Peast's location. But the police didn't believe his story. They checked his criminal background and found alarming reports of battery and a prison sentence in Iowa for sexual assault against a teenage boy. With search warrant in hand, the police entered Gacy's home and discovered many suspicious items such as jewellery, driver's license, male clothing that didn't fit Gacy, handcuffs and syringes. They also found a receipt from the pharmacy the priest worked at, which had been in the pocket of his jacket when he disappeared. As the police continued to investigate Gacy and obtain statements from Rignall and the relatives of the missing young men, they kept Gacy under surveillance. True to Gacy's character, he attempted to befriend the detectives, inviting them to his home for food and eating out at restaurants with them. He continually denied knowing anything about Priest. But Gacy began to crack, and on December the 18th, he filed a civil suit against the Des Plaines police for their constant surveillance. The police persisted and continued to search his home, noting a smell of rotten flesh, and spoke with two of his former roommates who also worked for PDM contractors, confirming that they both dug trenches in his crawl space. On December the 20th, Gacy met with his lawyers regarding his civil suit and confessed not only to Priest's murder, but indicated that there had been many others. After witnessing Gacy hand off a package containing marijuana to a gas station worker, the police arrested Gacy. In the meantime, their second search warrant was approved and they went back to his home to look for Priest's body. They started in the crawl space, and while they didn't find Priest, they found the remains of many other victims. On the morning of December the 22nd, Gacy confessed to killing between 25 and 30 males. Gacy described the torture he inflicted upon his victims and his rope trick. He told the police where his victims were buried throughout his home, including the garage, the backyard, and the crawl space. It took several months to extract all the remains of the victims Gacy buried in his home. 3 bodies that had previously been found in the Des Plaines River were attributed to Gacy, and Priest's body wasn't recovered until April 1979. In total, 29 bodies were found in Gacy's home. Gacy was finally convicted of 33 murders and sentenced to death on March 12, 1980. Though he attempted to appeal his sentence several times, Gacy was executed by lethal injection on May 10, 1994. Gacy insisted after his arrest that he hadn't worked alone, and some of his business travel overlaps with the disappearances of some of his victims. Rignall, one of Gacy's assault victims, also stated that he saw another man in the house while he was being tortured. Investigators continue to believe that Gacy likely did have accomplices, but no one was officially investigated. After his death, many of Gacy's paintings were auctioned off, and more than 300 people, including several family members of Gacy's victims, gathered together to burn the artwork. 6 of Gacy's victims have yet to be identified, but investigators continue to search for their identities. John Wayne Gacy, the killer clown, will remain one of the cruelest serial killers in history for the horrific pain he inflicted upon his victims and their families.